Well, Grammar 2 students, this week we have to talk about functional grammar. This is a topic which won't be absolutely new for you, I hope, because we have talked about functional grammar and some of the main concepts found at the basis of functional grammar. So, let me share my screen with you, okay? And we're going to talk then about, as I said, systemic functional grammar. My question is, which is the name that comes to your mind when I say systemic functional grammar? That's my first question. Yes, of course, Michael Halliday. Okay, Michael Halliday would be the key figure within systemic functional grammar. This week with Jorge, you're working with the other, I would say, very important perspective on the study of grammar, that is generativism, okay, whose key figure is Chomsky. Well, now here we are working with systemic functional grammar. Now, where does functional grammar come from? Let's try to see, let's remember what was happening at the beginning of the 20th century. We had structuralism, we had the Saussure in Europe, and we also talked about how structuralism developed in America. We mentioned the key linguist within structuralism in the USA was Bloomfield, who followed a clearly behavioristic approach. All right, but in Europe, we had Saussure, and we also have some linguists who belonged into what is known as the Prague School of Linguistics, which somehow combined systemic, structuralism, which had these basic theses that we had to study lang as a system in itself. So they had this idea of the system, but they added a functional component. Within the Prague School, they believed language was a system of means to an end. And that's why I say they add a functional component, okay? Language is not, the system is not studied in itself, as a self-contained unit. It is opened up towards its functions. They aim not just at describing, but also at explaining that system. Some of the important linguists, okay, which you may have heard. So before going into functional grammar, we think of a first influence. We mentioned the Prague School, and within the Prague School, we have names such as Mathesius, who is probably the one who is first associated with the Prague School, but also Trubetskoy, who had some very important studies within the field of phonology, and then some other names such as Buehler, who explored language functions because they were interested in the functions performed by language. Buehler and also Jacobson, who also studied the functions of language. Particularly, he explored the poetic function of language. So his book, Linguistics and Poetics, in 1960, is really important within the field of literature, for example. Here we are talking about, let's say, the 1920s. So this is what was happening in Europe. And later on in Europe, we have to talk as some kind of influence on functional grammar, part of the origins of functional grammar. We should also talk about the London School around the 1940s, okay? And the names associated with the London School, from which Halliday himself evolved, the names were Malinowski. In fact, Malinowski was not a linguist, but an anthropologist, but he is the one who coined the term context of situation, which will play such an important role within functional grammar. Malinowski, then we would say, I don't know, Firth, but here we have Jones. They are all linguists or yes, linguists working in Europe, following this tradition initiated by structuralism. So here, in the end, we get into functional grammar. We have already mentioned Michael Halliday as the key figure, who wrote his introduction to functional grammar, which has several editions. Okay, you have probably read some chapters from functional grammar. So let's move to functional grammar itself. It is a systemic functional grammar, and it has an idea of language, a definition, a conception of language, which goes, and I'm quoting here, a system for making meanings, a semantic system with other systems for encoding the meanings it produces. If we look at this quotation, we will see again this idea of language as a system. That's why it is systemic. And we also see that we have the word, I have underlined the word meanings. Then there is another quotation, and we also have the word meanings there, because as we have already said, within functional grammar, meaning plays a key role. Here we say that we think of language as a semantic system, okay? A system of meanings accompanied by forms through which the meanings can be realized. Probably this rings a bell in Grammar 1 when we talk about formal and functional grammar. We are basically referring to formal grammar, which will be generativism, and functional grammar, which would correspond to systemic functional grammar. So we see how meaning is the starting point of systemic functional grammar, accompanied by forms, okay? In fact, in his introduction to functional grammar, he explains why that he's using the word grammar, but in fact he means lexical grammar. He thinks of lexis and grammar as the opposite ends of a continuum. He says grammar is functional because it studies how language is used to perform its functions. Within this theory, we think of grammar as natural. Grammar evolves to satisfy human needs. And we say that it is systemic because we said it is a theory of meaning as choice. It is a network of interlocking options. All right, we have a system of systems. And Halliday himself explains that systemic functional grammar is paradigmatic in orientation. In fact, he explains that he believes that from these, remember, paradigmatic and syntagmatic relations, we have different perspectives. In Europe, grammar was developed through paradigmatic studies, And in America, studies were more syntagmatic in orientation. So what do we mean? Well, here, when you think of systemic functional grammar, we are always exploring the meaning-making potential of grammar, okay? And when we think of potential, we are thinking of the paradigm. The unit of analysis of functional grammar, as we already mentioned in Grammar 1, goes up to the text, okay? The text would be the highest unit of analysis, and it has the purpose of not just understanding a text, but also evaluating. How can we evaluate how effective a text is? Well, only by taking into account the context of situation. Remember, we already mentioned this context of situation as a term coined by Balinowski. The text is studied following two complementary perspectives. What does it mean? Remember this question of what is it we study? And we may go back to Saussure, okay? Is it langue or parole? Well, here, systemic functional grammar's explanation is that we study the text from two perspectives: as an artifact, as a specimen. That is, as an object on its own right, and as an instrument. Sorry, we are studying language, okay, as an artifact or as a specimen. Basically, the system can only be studied in the form of a text. We study the text as an instance, as a window into the system, and we also study the text in itself. Now, if we will move on and we go deeper into the context of situation, Halliday, when referring to the context of situation, he mentions three elements that should be taken into account, which are field, related to the social action, including the topic; tenor, the relationships among participants; and mode, the resources for text production. I mean, when we study language and we study a text and we want to evaluate that text, we should take into account what is happening, who are the ones involved and what's their relationship, how is the text produced, is it spoken or written, for example. Meaning, this is something we have already discussed in Grammar 1, and it is very important because, as we said before, meaning plays a key role within the theory. You know about the three metafunctions: the ideational, interpersonal, and textual metafunction. Remember, the ideational meaning related to the way we represent the world around us, interpersonal meaning related to the way we interact, and textual meaning the way we produce text. Halliday will use these as a basis for his whole theory, and he will develop categories to study. In the first case, the clause as representation, then the clause as exchange, and finally, the clause as message. When he studies the clause as representation, that is when he's dealing with ideational meaning, he studies the system of transitivity, and he will study processes, participants, and circumstances. All right, different kinds of processes which are typically realized by means of verb groups, participants realized through noun groups, and circumstances through adverbial groups or prepositional phrases. We are not going to deal with these in depth, but well, he has a subclassification of processes, okay, material processes or relational processes. And depending on the kinds of processes, we also have different kinds of participants, okay? Notice that I'm using the word group. Remember, within functional grammar, they will use the word group and restrict the word phrase for the prepositional phrase. Within interpersonal meaning, we are studying then the clause as exchange, and basically Halliday suggests studying these exchanges in terms of whether we are giving or demanding goods and services or information. And then he combines them to get to the 4 primary speech functions. An offer as a speech function could correspond to giving goods and services. A statement would correspond to giving information. A command would correspond to demanding goods and services, and a question demanding information. So he develops the categories of mood and residue to try to account for the different possible combinations related to interpersonal meaning. Last, when he talks about textual meaning, he develops the categories of theme and rhyme. We are not going to deal with many categories from functional grammar. We are going to focus, and we are going to briefly explore these categories of theme and rhyme, particularly because there is a lot of literature, sometimes related to discourse analysis, which makes use of these categories of theme and rhyme and thematic structure. So the idea now is I will start a new video where we will deal with the clause as message, and we will explore the categories of theme and rhyme.